I'm Dr. Michael P. Williams, founding pastor of the Genesis Church in Houston, Texas, and this is a series of interviews that we do with great preachers that have come to bless the Genesis family and to be a blessing to all Christians in the city of Houston. And we have with us today one of the most distinguished preachers in America today, a man who has probably done more cross-cultural preaching at this stage of his ministry than almost anyone you can find, and who serves not only the church but also the academy. And that is none other than Dr. Joel C. Gregory, who is professor of preaching at the George Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University, president of Joel Gregory Ministries. And we're glad to have you here, Joel.
Well, thank you, Dr. Williams. A delight to be back once again in your presence and to have participated in the events of this day with you.
It was tremendous. This is the weekend of Dr. King's birthday. And it's also the weekend where President Barack Obama is going to be inaugurated a second time. And you came today to speak for the Bay Ridge Christian College, of which I have the privilege of serving as chair of the board, for the inaugural lecture series for the King Germany lecture series that you've come today. And it was a powerful message on irony and synchronicity. And we're going to make sure that our YouTube people get a chance to see some of that. But as you travel around the country, what do you think is the thing that's ailing the church most today?
Well, I think one thing that is shaking many churches is what I might call the death of cultural Christianity in America. Up probably until the 1960s in much of this country, there was cultural cachet in being in church. There's no longer that meta-narrative. That has disintegrated. And for me, I think it's not a bad thing, but a good thing, because a lot of it had created a kind of a folk religion almost in the name of Christianity, and that all those props are gone. And it's clearing the way for an authentic renewal of the Christian faith. I think in the secularization of postmodern America, it's going to be a real choice to be a Christian.
As it was in the beginning.
In the beginning.
A choice.
Ancient, modern, yeah.
Yeah, it seemed that for so long, I guess, the Constantinian arrangement, had created a two sides of the same coin, church and culture, and now that's being stripped away. Well, what then, how does that affect preaching? Preaching has been the passion of your life and mine, and you've dedicated yourself not just to its practice, but also its academic examination, and you're raising a generation of preachers through Proclaimers Place, 600 alumni of Proclaimers Place here in the United States and at Oxford, and traveling across the country. What does the death of cultural Christianity, how does that affect preaching?
Well, I think it affects it in the sense that a lot of the props that gave preachers their authority in the past are disappearing. Ordinarily, in American history, there'd been a lot of respect for ordination, for the ecclesiastical accoutrements of preaching, the reverend doctor, a lot of strength given to someone's profession. I've been called to preach. Most of those are disappearing. Postmoderns are not that interested in ecclesial ceremonies, ordination, position. They like charisma, and they still have some respect for education of clergy. But a lot of the other stage properties around ministry no longer command the respect of an increasingly secular culture. And to get heard in the 21st century, in post-modernity, some people even now talking about post-postmodernity.
Post-post, that's
is certainly going to be tied to authenticity. There used to be the case that preachers, ministers could somehow be removed from people or not enmeshed in the common circumstances of humankind, even in their congregation. I think that's going to be a lot tougher. People are going to have to live in the same house on Sunday and on Monday.
The whole concept of clergy and laity is sometimes a false distinction, at least in the New Testament view of ministry, but it exists today with clergy as a profession, somewhat said. Do you think that the changes that we're experiencing today are going to lead more toward bivocational ministry? as it was once in the beginning?
They could. In fact, I think you're seeing a great deal of the entrepreneurial church startups in the evangelical world are some combination of bivocation. That distinction between clergy and laity is also likely going to continue to be diminished. A lot of the clerical life has been demystified because of everything we've been talking about. And that's not to say that it's not a dignified vocation, but a lot of that's been demystified. And in the larger culture, there's not as much mystery around the persona of a preacher as perhaps there once was.
You know, you mentioned about, you used that phrase about being heard in the 21st century, in a time where people are, from a sensory standpoint, are being bombarded by so many things in the media. Attention spans have shrunk. The rapidity to which culture moves, that, you know, I hear kids talking about old music that was like 6 months ago. You know, last year's record, where old for us is the 70s. You know, how does that affect preaching stylistically as you're looking at the generational divide of preachers?
Well, I think it affects it tremendously because most of us in our generation of preachers did a kind of a linear, deductive preaching, whereas the young people sitting in front of us now live not so much in a linear world, as almost a spiral world, like a nautilus. They'll get a little blip from YouTube where we are right now. They'll get a text message, they'll hear a song, and they'll get with their group, which is a real authority for postmoderns, my group, how we feel about it. And it's kind of like a nautilus. So a highly linear style, point, sub-point, sub-point, that kind of scholastic thing, I think we'll have a harder time getting heard than a more narrative style of preaching.
So what does that say for us dinosaurs who are still trying to preach from a linear perspective?
Well, we got to mess it up something, I think. We've got to intentionally, even though we may think linear in our head, in the actual delivery, in the event of preaching, I think we've got to be more narrative to get heard. And that's possible, even inside a deductive structure. But, but to be far more narrative, more story-like than ABC 1, 2, 3.
As we bring this conversation to a close, you've had a marvelous opportunity to do cross-cultural preaching, particularly in African-American churches, and you've had a chance to see both sides of the evangelical divide between Anglo churches and African-American churches. What do you find unique about the African-American Christian witness, which is different than the other?
Well, from the standpoint of the people in the pew, as an itinerant preacher, I was in 18 states last year, so a lot of American Christianity, black and white versions. And one of the things that strikes me is that in just every black church I'm in, there's a sense of most people in the pew that I may hear something today that will really change things for me. That's just almost palpable. You can feel it. I'm waiting for a word that will get me through a Monday through Friday week. That creates a tremendous situation for preaching, that expectancy. Not everywhere, but in a lot of white Christianity, there's not that sense of expectancy that I'm going to get something that will really get me. Sometimes I use the idea that for white folks, some of them, not everybody, but for some, coming to church is a little more like taking a pill I need to take and get on down the way. There may not be that expectancy. I think another thing about the African American church is the proximity, the closeness, the nearness in the heart of the person in the pew to the biblical story. It's not like you're having to leap over 3,400 years to get back to the Exodus.
Right.
It's now. The Hebrew children are in there now. You know, Jesus is touching me now. And that kind of immediacy also creates a wonderful situation in preaching.
Why don't you think that African American churches, because they come in all styles and shapes, and you know, they're both high church, low church, ecclesiastical, storefront. Why don't you think that we draw representative numbers of Anglos into our churches, as opposed to the way it flows in the other direction?
Yeah. Well, you know, if I were guessing, I'd say 2 or 3 things. And this is not, I'm being descriptive.
Yeah, sure.
Not prescriptive.
Sure.
For very understandable reasons, when African Americans come to church, they're not in any hurry to get out. Mm-hmm. You know, it's their place. I fully understand and vet that. One of the least helpful trends in a good deal of the Caucasian version of Christianity is the continuing collapsing of time in church. Until now, we've got close to the town where I live, we've got this thing assigned, 30-minute church. Get in, get out.
Wow.
30-minute church. So I think probably the relative value placed on time being together may be one thing for older folks. Now, I have a prediction, and the prediction is this, that in postmodern 21st century America, black churches are going to become increasingly attractive to non-churched, secular, younger whites who are looking anywhere for some authenticity,
some community,
yeah, celebrate, just something to pick them up, because they no longer have any meta-narrative. So I'm not a prophet or a son of prophet, but sure. I think if you were looking at American Christianity, say 50 years from now,
sure,
you will see a movement of younger, postmodern, white Americans in significant numbers in the black churches.
As we close, Joel, and I thank you again, remember this is Dr. Joel Gregory, professor of preaching at Baylor University, president of Joel Gregory Ministries, my friend and brother who's here with us this weekend in Houston. If you had one piece of helpful advice to give a preacher, what would you tell him?
This may sound very prescriptive. Study out loud. We preachers sit and study in silence, and then we get up and talk. I would say study out loud. As you're reading exegetical commentary, read them out loud. When something strikes you to say preaching, start preaching right there out loud. We spend the week in silence, and then we get up
to talk.
To talk.
That's an interesting point. Once again, there's nobody like Joel Gregory. Thank you, Joel, for being with us. God bless you. We love you, man. Thank you.